Kia ora all, and thank you for making the time to join this meeting and hear more about the TB review plan. During our shareholder meetings with Osprey, we regularly discuss the views of our farmers and levy payers, sharing both compliments and concerns. These conversations help ensure that your experiences and perspectives are reflected in the decisions being made. Even if you've never faced TB on your farm, this plan affects you and it affects the whole sector. So every farmer's voice matters in shaping how we move forward. We're joined today by Jonathan and soon to be Stu from Osprey. Stu's travelling at the moment, so will come in when he can, who will be telling you more about the review and the proposed changes. We're also joined by Will Halliday, who's our veterinarian from Beef and Lamb, who will be assisting them in answering any questions you have. And I will now hand over to Will for some quick housekeeping. Thanks, Will.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alan, and welcome everybody to the webinar. Just a quick note that we will be recording this webinar. The recording will be put up onto the Beef and Lamb website in due course. We have a hard stop at 1:30 p.m. this afternoon. So to keep things moving, if you do have questions for any of our presenters, we invite you to put them into the Q&A, which you can see on the top of your screen there. So put it into the Q&A function if you please can. We will address your questions following the Osprey presentation. If we don't quite get to all the questions, we will endeavour to follow up by another means, probably email. So it is my pleasure now to introduce Jonathan Rudge, who is the project lead for the TB National Pest Management Plan. So Jonathan, please take it away.
Kia ora tātou, yes, Jonathan Rudge. As Will said, I'm the TB program plan review lead, and I'll set out the process. I'll just share the presentation and we'll get underway. So just confirming that everyone can see that on full screen.
Yes, thanks, Jonathan.
Okay, so I'll quickly move into the next one. So over the next 30 to 40 minutes, I will work through introduce the review and where we're at in terms of the progress and the state of the review, and what is actually being proposed through the consultation period, and have some discussion around the impacts, including the benefits, the costs, and the funding, which of course is very important to levy payers. So bovine TB does remain a serious risk for New Zealand. It is a risk primarily nowadays to animal health, but historically has been of human health, and indeed if it did ever get back out of control, even with pasteurisation, there would be significant human health impacts. And even today, although the source of it is unclear, there is around sort of one or more bovine TB cases in New Zealand a year. The management of TB, as you may well all be aware, is under the National Pest Management Plan, which is a regulatory instrument, in fact, under the Biosecurity Act. So it actually has legal bite, so to speak. And that has been under the Pest Management Plan since around 1998. Great progress has been made in that time under the National Pest Management Plan, indeed sort of in the early days, and I'll go through some of the sort of historic situation, but in the early days the focus very much was trying to get the disease under control and managed in herds, and trying to minimize the infection that came out of the possums, out of the wildlife vector. Over the sort of 15 or so years, or 20 years really, it moved to the last plan review in 2015 when, with confidence, they could move to actually targeting eradication of the disease, which is meaning getting the disease out of both the livestock, but also out of the possums in particular, but wildlife more broadly across New Zealand. And the disease will continue to spread without that focus on eradication. So it is important that the review has found that is important to continue to maintain that focus. So I'll now move on to a little bit more about what the review is about and the process before we describe that, what the proposal in detail is. So, as I said, the TB plan is in fact a regulatory instrument under the Biosecurity Act, and the Biosecurity Act requires the TB plan to be reviewed at least every 10 years, and it is now 10 years since the last review took place. It is delivered operationally by Osprey through its TB-free program, and I'm sure you're all quite familiar with that. The review has been driven by the funders rather than Osprey, so it's in many ways seen to be it is independent of Osprey. It's overseen by a planned governance group of the funders, and the funders are made up of Ministry of Primary Industries as on behalf of the government, and the chief executives, and Mary Van Andel, the chief vet from MPI, sits on that. The chief executives of each of the industry bodies of DINS, Dairy New Zealand, and Beef and Lamb are also on the group. It is chaired by an independent chair, Dr. Helen Anderson, who has a long background in governance and in research and science in the primary sectors. There are also representatives as observers from DOC and Osprey on the governance group. That is supported by a review advisory group, which has technical and policy expertise from across the funders, but also from Osprey and DOC, and that review advisory group was chaired, or is being chaired, by Dr. Stu Hutchings, who some of you may be familiar with. Has a history with the TB-free program, but also more recently was the chief biosecurity advisor for MPI, and then myself and a number of others are in the secretariat that support the process. Very early on in the review, it was agreed by the funders, including the minister, that the current cap of $60 million a year would continue, and the current 40-60 Crown industry share would remain. And within that, the industry groups have also agreed that the current arrangements for intra-industry, i.e. the share between the deer, the beef and the dairy industries remain, the formula and the approach remains the same. So the review kicked off last year, that started with a range of independent reviews of the science, the technology, disease modelling. It also some reviews around the financial assumptions, and I'll speak to that shortly. And then the PGG considered a range of different options for proceeding, and again I'll run through what that is to come up with, and that all resulted in coming up with the proposal which we're setting out today. Right now we're in that engagement and consultation process, and it's a genuine process that we want to go out and speak to interested parties, but especially the farmers, the 60% funders, the principal beneficiaries of the plan, to get their views. And so this webinar is one of those, but there is also a range of farmer-focused meetings across the country, and that information is up on the TB Plan Review website, but it's also available through Beef and Lamb. At the end of the consultation, there will be a process of reviewing the feedback received, and and the PGG will review and update its proposal, taking into account of that. And the plan is to have that proposal in front of the minister before the end of the year, and that will hopefully give time for the minister to consider it, engage with cabinet on any of the changes, and have that in place by the middle of next year, well in advance, hopefully, of the election. In the meantime, Osprey will, as a result of that, Osprey will update its national operational plan, and it is already taking into account some of the findings from the review where it doesn't require regulatory change, and they're slowly introducing those operational changes. So I suppose the most important thing really was that is the evidence there for continuing with the plan as it is, or in the management of the disease under an eradication approach or alternatives. And the reviews that were commissioned of Manaaki Whenua and a number of other independent scientific and technical consultants found that the science and the methodology for underpinning the approach to eradication remains sound, and the tools that are being used are effective at achieving that eradication objective. It also reinforced the interrelationship between the disease in the vector, the possum, and on a few occasions in the South Island, potentially ferrets, that while there is infection in those vector populations, in particular the possum populations, there will continue to be infection in livestock. Under the current regime, management regime of TB3, that is keeping it at a very, very low level, but they will not be able to get it down to that zero level until the disease is actually eradicated from possums. And that's an important learning. It was understood last time, but I think the lived experience of the last 10 years of implementing the TB plan has shown, and in particular, say in the Hawke's Bay, that you really do need to keep managing the disease in those infected possum populations. There was a substantive scan of whether there's new technology, science, whatever coming on. And we're all aware that there's quite a lot that's coming through in drone technology and AI, and that was all considered. And there may be some potential to deploy some of that in the next few years. But basically, there are no silver bullets coming, and certainly not in time for the program to deliver the eradication in the next 10 to 12 years, which is the proposal. But the tools that Osprey does have do work, and so that's a critical part of that's informed the PGG considerations. The other element of the review was reviewing the financial assumptions of the 2015 rather, costings of the TB plan. And although large chunks of those and the way the funding was allocated were reasonably sound, one key issue emerged was that a decision back in 2015 by the funders of the plan not to include account for inflationary pressures on the basis that continuous technological improvements would deliver efficiencies to counter that has not proven to be the case. And that has been, and hindsight says that's not surprising. That it may have been the case in the period leading up to 2015, where there was quite a lot of advancement in understanding of the disease, understanding of the use of the toxins, and development of new technologies to deliver them, but those gains just weren't going to happen, and that has had an impact on the amount of funding available on an annual basis for Osprey to focus on particularly that vector control space. And as a result of that, it is the proposal that's being put forward by the governance group will take into account, does take into account the impact of inflation over the coming years. So just a little bit of a reminder of where we've come from, and really the success to date. It is really quite a dramatic thing. So, back in the 70s, the disease was quite significant. You had 1,400 herds of a much smaller number of overall herd, national herd. Various regional programs of disease management came in. The understanding of the relationship of the disease infection coming through and being reinforced from the vector was understood, and therefore the management of possums started to come in. And that led to quite a significant reduction. And unfortunately, in those sort of that late 1980s period, or in the 80s altogether, the financial situation the government found itself in meant that the funding of the program did fall away, and that results in that increase in herd infection. It got up to about 1694 exactly, or let us say 1,700 herds in around 1995, and that was when the decision was made to move to a national plan and a national program. And you could see with the increased investment in both vector control and disease management, the impact that has had over time, right up to now, where we have around 16 herds as of today, but that still represents a 0.01% of herds infected, whereas back in 1995 it was sitting around 4% of the national herd. And the one thing I think you farmers understand is that it's not just the infected herds in the farms, and it's also all those other farms that are affected by movement control areas, and that has also radically reduced. And then on the right hand side you can see the amount of infection and the vector risk areas in the possums, and the reduction that has happened over time. And we've now got to a point in 2025 where, if you look at those red spots, which is where the highly infected possum populations are, they remain primarily now in 2 spots in the central North Island and in central Otago, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So as part of the process of considering options, the governance group requested to sort of look at 3 broadly. That was, what if we did nothing? What if we actually just said, okay, we've spent a lot of money, let's go just to contain the disease and manage it. It's down to 15 herds. And what would it mean if we continue to eradicate? And to be very clear, that taking the foot off the pedal, the no control, was not being put forward as a viable option. It was more setting out the baseline by which you could compare the other options, in particular the containment and the eradication options. But it does tell a very stark story that is probably unsurprising given the previous graphic of what happened in the 70s and 80s. The disease would start to pick up and move across the South Island and the North Island, and by 2035, and I think the modelling says around 2033, we would be back at that 0.2% threshold of 100 that the World Animal Health Organization has set as a TB freedom. That's 120 or so, 130 herds, and by 2040 it would be much more, and by the time we got to 2055 the disease would be right across the country, and both livestock and vectors. But that is, of course, where there is no management regime, and that was never a consideration. The governance group did look at the containment model. It is valid in these tight financial times to say, well, what would that look like? And maybe we should just go to say, throw up some buffers around the key infected areas and continue to manage the disease at very low levels in the herds. But there's a number of challenges with that. You do get leakage. If you've got infection, you will continue to get leakage. The buffers would therefore have to be quite big. They tend to be in areas where you can't use aerial 1080, so you would be having to use ground control, which is a much more expensive tool. And in effect, what you would found is that on a financial basis, you would very quickly get to that 60 million cap per year just trying to contain the disease by around 2032, 33, and then after that you would actually start to exceed that cap. And of course, that is also in perpetuity. If you're containing, you're saying we're just going to manage, and that would have meant long-term ongoing costs. So eradication remained the only game in town, and then that's not surprising, but it does come at a cost. And so the governance group wanted to look at a number of different options around how that could be done. And initially, looking at on the first point, what is happening now, and what's happening now, that status quo that came in 2021 off the back of the breakdowns in Hari Hari and the Hawke's Bay, where a greater emphasis of vector control is on is in the buffer zones and to protect the herds, and having a high level of testing to maximise the potential for early detection and case management. And that, in doing that and modelling that pushed out from the current timeframes of 2040 to 20 for livestock and for possum freedom, pushed that out further to 2042, and the livestock freedom got pushed out even further, and the cost a lot higher. So you would still be doing a lot of operations well into the late 2030s and into 2040s. So then said, okay, well, what if we do actually look at the optimal approach using the best tool available? So prioritizing the disease, and that proves to be prioritizing the disease, eliminating the disease from the possums, in particular in those most highly infected areas in Central North Island and Central Otago, and moving to a targeted TB testing. And as you can see, that comes up at a sort of a cost of 721 million, and delivering both the livestock and TB freedom within that 2040 miles of current TB freedom and vectors of 2040, acknowledging that the livestock will still continue to have some small amount of infection while that disease is in the vectors in the possums. Looked at that, and obviously, and I'm sure a number of you are aware, there are challenges to doing some of the operations, in particular in the Central North Island. There's challenges to using aerial 1080, and so the governance group also asked the modelling to look at what would happen if you used more ground control in those areas, and what would be the impact of that. And as I say, you can see there in the middle that would be, you'd probably just still hit some of those sort of milestones. It would come at a greater cost, but one of the key issues and key concerns was that using ground-based controls in some of those areas, particularly in the Central North Island, there's no evidence, it's not been proven to be effective, and that leaves quite a material risk of leaving disease behind in the residual refuges of possum populations from which it can bounce back. So as I say, the governance group, their proposed approach is to focus, continuing to use the aerial 1080 as the most optimal tool for those difficult to access areas. And the proposal is same overall objective: eradication of bovine TB by 2055, and that means gone from the country. That means gone from not just the possums and from the livestock, but also those maintenance hosts, which of deer and pigs, which don't spread the disease. It doesn't transmit back into it. They're very much end points of the disease, but they can. It does. There is potential for possums to be reinfected from them by scavenging on forest floors, etc. So it's important to actually get all infected wildlife eradicated. The milestone has been amended to reflect the fact that we'll not be able to get complete freedom from livestock until it's gone from the possums. So the proposal is to amend it to that 2040, and they all come into a line there. What that means in terms of the way the program will go from here on is that the PGG are proposing that Osprey now prioritise those remaining hotspots in the central North Island. So that's the challenges are different in each of those. In the central North Island, it's very rugged, difficult to access country, very remote. There's areas which is very challenging to actually go in and control by any other means other than aerial control. Whereas in the Central Otago, it's a far more sparsely populated area. It's a large area of sparsely populated infected possum populations, which need to be identified, targeted, all within what is pastoral, largely pastoral country. So the challenges are different, and the approaches will need to be different, but the important thing is really that if the disease is to be cleared from possums and vectors by 2040, these things need to be started. The vector control in those two areas needs to be started as soon as possible, because once you start operating and trying to use that landscape scale operation, you have to sustain it over 5 to 7 years, and it's not just one operation, it's 2 to 3 operations over that period. Any sort of halt in that or partial delivery will set the program back. And that means in the central North Island, where there has been some challenges with different landowners and iwi and hapu and the Crown management of the land in that area, there are some challenges of getting access to the land that Osprey will need to continue to build on and develop its relationships with those landowners at place to get the support for the program to deliver. And the modelling of the program does take into account additional time and effort to get that in place. I think it's also important, though, to note that it doesn't mean that the other areas of the country that have infected possums will be ignored. Osprey will continue to progressively clear those VRAs in those other areas, as you're sort of seeing in lowest North Island at the moment, and then on the west coast, and so that is still expected to continue. Just sort of touching a bit more on the challenge in the central North Island. Osprey has had quite a bit of success in the last 2 to 3 years to deliver the relationships with the different landowners, and that includes the Māori authorities and iwi and hapu, but it also includes some substantive forestry holdings in that area, areas that are being managed for game animal hunting, and that comes with its own challenges. So there is a whole process to work with them, and the governance group are very supportive of Osprey continuing to invest in that program, and that will involve a range of different tools there in terms of trying to align the program's outcomes with the longer term objectives of those different landowners and land managers. It may involve different investment into local capability and tools, which not only will help them deliver the program, but ultimately potentially continue to sustain the gains thereafter. So that's sort of the big picture stuff that's being proposed by the governance group. There are a number of smaller technical clarifications being proposed that need to be made within that regulation. This is not operational, it's changed to the regulation. And those are around trying to make some of the things that are getting in the way of the program operate a little bit better, and some of it's about future proofing. So in the instance of that first one, we're talking about being able to changing the rules to enable TB-free osprey to undertake vector control activities right across the country. At the moment, it's largely constrained by the rules to vector risk areas, and obviously as we move to responding to maybe the occasional breakdown, but more importantly, trying to do longer term assurance surveillance that the disease is gone, which will start kicking in the 2030s and need to be sustained through the 2050s, that osprey is able to go in and do vector control and vector for surveillance and purposes, as well as any mop-up. The second one is a very simple one at the moment. The declaration, TB declaration is, say, 6 months, and as you're all aware, that the ASD, you need to keep them for 12 months, so it just tidies that up. The third one is probably of interest, in particular, more so for the dairy farmers, but it just enables osprey to get additional information around the source of samples that are coming, and this is future-proofing in the event that something like bulk tank milk testing comes in and allows TB-free to do surveillance of the dairy herd through bulk tank milk testing, and that of course would come with some benefits in terms of reduced need to do more invasive testing regime, etc. That's currently being trialled. The results are unknown at the moment, but this is about making sure that the tools are there and osprey's enabled. And the final one is around the release of pigs. At the moment, under the Wildlife Act and under the order, it's illegal to release pigs into the wild. We do want that to continue, but for research purposes, and again, this becomes quite important for surveillance purposes, there may be a reason for osprey to need to release pigs into the wild to monitor and track wild pig populations. Those are always under very set conditions of being able to track the animals that have been released and subsequently destroy them. So it's not about adding to the wild animal population. Then there are some operational changes that are coming through, and this one, the targeted testing, is already being rolled out by osprey, and this is about getting it. It reflects the nature of where the disease is and in the livestock now, and indeed where it is in terms of the vector, and it's trying to works to strike the right balance of having the testing and getting the information known to make sure you're having the right disease management choices and the right vector control choices, without imposing undue and high levels of impact on farmers. So that is, as I say, is being rolled out by osprey at the moment in the surveillance areas, so outside of movement control areas. It's based on using a wide range of criteria to identify those that are highest of risk, and including whether there's been presence of animals in the herd that have been infected, the number of animal movements into the area and out, herd size, production type, NAIT compliance, and all those are taken into account to help sort of identify and move to more targeted testing, and you'll see a reduced level of testing and a movement away from sort of the 3 and 5 year surveillance testing that has happened up to now. So let's move on to the next one, which is sort of associated with that. And again, this is a proposal, and particularly at this one, because we know a number of farmers are quite wedded to the current herd classification system. But there is so we're again, consulting on whether a more simplified approach to the herd status classification system. So I'm sure you're all aware of the current one where you have an index of C1 to C10, and that reflects the time since you've been tested and as a clear herd, and moving to something that's a little bit more straightforward. And this is sort of basically making that a little bit more fit for purpose and a little bit, hopefully remove a bit of the ambiguity. And one of the reasons is that they're going to be increasing ambiguity is because with the movement to the targeted testing, there will be some areas that will not be getting the follow-up testing and moving from, say, a C5 to C8 and then ultimately to a C10. So the proposal was to, as currently, if you, as a result of skin tests and things, and a herd would go into being suspended, and then if subject to further testing, if it was found to be not infected, it would go back to having a simple clear status. But if it was infected, it would move into an infected status and be put into case managed as currently, and that's equivalent to your sort of the I1 to 3, and it'll be infected until it's moves until the point at which the epidemiologists and the vets consider that the disease is probably gone from the herd, but still requires some sort of case management going forward. And so that's your C1 to C3. And then off the back, once it's gone through those C1 to C3, off the back of an assessment by the Osprey vets, if they determine that the disease is no longer present, it goes straight to clear, and the index to relation to testing is no longer there. So that's being proposed. It's not being saying it's going to be happening today or tomorrow. It's very much wanting to hear the feedback from farmers on that. So we get to the numbers, and I should just check my time. So up to now, there's been $1.9 billion spent since 1998. That doesn't count all the money that went in before then. That equates in today's dollars terms to around $2.7 billion. It's a lot of money. It's delivered a lot of benefit already. You know, if you think back to that graph you saw with the line of expenditure and then the declining herds, all that white space is basically a lot of farmers not having the disease, and that's a good thing. But it does need to be eradicated, and the updated modelling sort of forecast that it's going to cost around 720 million over the next 30 years, most of that in the next 11, 12 years, because it's tied to the vector control. And it still has a very strong benefit cost ratio. There is a real financial benefit to farmers from getting rid of the disease once and for all, but there is also an economic benefit to the government, to the country as a whole, and those health and environmental benefits still exist, and that those are a little bit lower than what they were last time, but that's unsurprising because a lot of those are tied to the fact that the disease is much lower in case of in the health, but then in the environment space, of course, there's a much reduced area, vector risk area, under control, and therefore those biodiversity benefits that contribute to some of those are much reduced as well. So what does that mean now? That means that what the proposal is saying is that as I've said earlier, that 60% of funding coming from the farmers continues through levies. The Crown contribution continues at 40%, and it continues to that $60 million out to 20. I can't actually see it because something from the PowerPoint, the Teams meetings in the way, out to around 2035. It needs to sustain that high level before quickly falling away. Unfortunately, because of that, what I touched on earlier around the impact of inflation and not accounting for that, there is a 120 million shortfall on what was forecast is needed to be spent compared to what was forecast as needed to be spent in 2015. And the Crown back then actually committed to funding the program on the basis of the modelling all the way out to 2055. And unfortunately, because of that change in the modelling and the adjustments, there is that shortfall, and it's around 48 million. Now, all the funders, industry and MPI, and including the Minister, are very committed to funding the program right through to 2055. But as you're all aware, there is that a big challenge in government to find funding. They have a lot of competing priorities, this tight fiscal environment. And so at this stage, it's proposed that rather than trying to sort all that out and deal right now, there will be a process to continue to engage between the Crown and the industry bodies to identify how they can address the shortfall and have a review of the funding in 2031. That would also be tied to a progress update to make sure that, yes, it does remain on target. The Osprey is making progress in the Central North Island and Central Otago. And quite possibly efficiencies may well have come in, and maybe that shortfall is not as big. But the proposal is that there will be a review of the funding then. So just the last quick couple of slides. For farmers, it's probably, what does it mean for you? It's probably more of the same in many ways. In vector control areas, with the targeted testing, you might not see a tester quite so often, or not at all if you're not deemed high enough. You'll have the potential simplified classification system, which hopefully will improve sort of consistencies with filling out ASD forms and obligations. For Osprey, there's the funders are very clear. They expect Osprey to really focus on achieving the eradication in the timeframes that they've set. It needs to work within that available time and with the money available and as effectively as possible, and support the proposed operational changes to deliver better results. So I think that is me. The consultation is running through to the 12th of October. More information is on the website, the tbplanreview.co.nz. You're welcome to make submissions online through that website, but you can also send email submissions, or even go old school and send in a postal one. They'll all be considered. Right, I think that's me. Thank you. I think I'll try to stop sharing, Jonathan. Shall I? Oh. There we go.
Excellent. Hey, thank you very much for that, Jonathan. Quite a bit of info to get through in a short period of time. So thank you very much for that. Now, we've had a few questions come through in the Q&A, and I've sort of, we've got a couple of themes that are coming through. The first question I'm going to put to you is around the targeted testing, and whether or not that will mean a greater risk of potentially infected herds, I guess, not being discovered through targeted testing.
I think the short answer is the work that's been done is no. There's always a risk, but the idea of moving to that sort of broader criteria-based, we already have a risk-based approach under the 3 stall. We'll do a certain amount in an MCA and a certain amount outside. This is just targeting it, and it reflects the current level of infection that exists. It does allow to really focus on those areas where where the infection is most likely to come back out and be spread from the herds, but also in relation to the vector, with the presence in the vector. I had another part of the answer that's gone out of my head now, but oh no, that's what it is. It was. I think the other thing is this is for those that have been around long enough, last time we talked about risk-based testing and hooking it into NATE and having that technological solution there. Although NATE is part of it, what the approach that Osprey's been developing and is currently rolling out in this first phase is based on the experience that's come into the organisation as a result, and the learnings from Bovis of casing and tracing, and it's very much informed by a lot of good best practice that has come out of that. So there is always risk. So but there is a good support of, say, the epidemiologists and the veterinarians and the people that know this stuff, that it is appropriate level of testing to detect the disease.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question here. So we've talked about eradicating possums in particular. How about other carriers of TB? And the example that's being provided is wild goats, but presumably we need to consider deer, pigs, and so on.
Yeah. So obviously the key thing that we're talking about is eradicating the disease from those animals. So there's two types of hosts. Basically, there's those that are maintenance hosts, such as the vectors of the possums, and then there is those like the wildlife, the pigs and the deer and the ferrets. To an extent, they sort of cross over a little bit to being a maintenance host in some areas, it seems. So the approach to doing that, and I'll just point out, it is the disease in terms of wild goats. It's not a disease of goats, so that's just not on the radar for the TB3 program. Obviously, for a pest management and broader program, obviously that's a big issue. And then wallabies is another example. It's not a disease of wallabies, but that's also of big concern to a lot of farmers. So the focus is on eradicating the disease in the possums. We know, though, with confidence where those infected possum populations is, and the whole underpinning methodology is about going in and reducing the density of the possum population to the point that they are unable to, an infected animal, possum is unable to interact with another healthy animal and then spread the disease. And that's why it takes 5 to 7 years. You've got to sort of hold it down, sustain it down at, I think it's around 1.5 of a possum per hectare or something. That you keep those down and sustain it down. In terms of the other wildlife, infected wildlife, is say that we're not picking up a lot in the wild deer or wild pig. They do get detected occasionally. They can be a source of infection back into the possum population, but if we're talking about vector-free areas, though, a lot of surveillance is already telling us that the disease isn't in those populations. But as the disease, so the key priority of getting it out of the wildlife is to get it out of the possums, sustain and monitor it, and all the science and evidence to date says that those infected deer and pigs in those areas, they don't transmit it back into others. Once they die, the disease is gone. So that's why there's a really long tail of 15 years from 2040, because that is the period in which you get a generation or a generation and a half of pig and deer infected to die out. But there is a need to be assured that that's not happening, and there's a program that Osprey will need to start ramping up as they get on top of the disease in the possums and in the livestock, to be confident that they're monitoring and surveilling the wildlife across the country, that the disease isn't present anywhere. And if they did detect it, they can then go in and do a sort of incisive precision control.
Okay, thank you for that. There's a couple of related questions here. We've got one that regarding possum numbers in Otago, where the somebody says the numbers appear to be increasing, despite the fact that TB is still evident or present in the Upper Otago region. Does the council not already have a responsibility alongside Osprey to manage these? And I guess linked to that is the question about once you've eliminated TB from a possum population, who's responsible for controlling those possums?
And this is increasingly an issue. I can't really speak to what's happening operationally in Otago, and I think what we'll try to do is get some information back from Osprey on exactly what's happening there. And I don't know, obviously we've got the breakdowns that are happening in and around the Marama area. So I don't want to speak and mislead on that. I think it's probably better to get information from Osprey on that. In terms of what happens afterwards, they're basically pest control is a responsibility of regional councils under the RMA. And as they take on greater responsibilities if they identify them as a pest for management, and they can sort of go down the route of developing a regional pest management plan, which is similar to the National Pest Management Plan, but it's based on the regional council boundaries. There's not any in this that I'm aware of at the moment in that space. They do have a responsibility, but it's all about competing funding priorities, and we know also, not just like central government, where some of those priorities sit for the regional councils. That all said, the part of the historically there's always been an effort in Osprey to try and do a good handover through to the regional councils and have initiatives to sustain the gain in effect. Those have had good and bad results over time. Arguably parts of the Wellington Regional Council program are still delivering some good benefits, but possum populations are still increasing despite that. It is, but it is the responsibility of the regional councils, unless they are identified as a pest under the MPI legislation. Osprey, much as I suspect would like to be able to continue to do that, it's not funded to manage possums per se or any of those other things. There's a similar thing with deer. It's there to get rid of the tuberculosis.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. There's a question here regarding education to hunters and the younger generation. Who will continue this arm of information sharing as part of the plan? Is that a question that you can answer, John?
Well, well, probably not. I'm always good at winging things, but obviously Osprey is going to be around for a while yet, as part of its program, but most of its program is related to the area it's operates. So if you go back to that map of where we are in 2025, increasingly it's a low area. Osprey does work very closely with DOC, and has a good, strong relationship with it, both at a strategic but also at a local operational level. So I would imagine there would be discussions there. They also have good relations with most of the regional councils with the regional councils that in the areas they operate on. And again, I would be expecting that some of the advice and support, but I'm not quite sure what sort of advice and support. If you're talking about management of diseased animals and things, that would still come out of Osprey, and to an extent that would be followed through at a much lower scale once it was out of the possums and livestock.
Okay, great. I think we've got time for just one more, and that is, at what point did Osprey I guess, make the determination or become aware that it was going to be unable to reach the 2026 goal?
That's always been a challenge. What I'd say is that what's happened through the review process is that we refreshed our understanding of the disease and the disease dynamic. Reflect back to 2015, and the 2026 milestone actually came out of the modelling then, but what was actually in the proposal, what was consulted on, what was in the proposal, always recognised that there would be a low level of infection in the livestock until the, as I say, it's gone from the possums. What actually happened was more of an issue at the drafting stage of the legislation, of the regulation, in that there were two elements of it. Under the Biosecurity Act, there's a requirement to have at least some sort of milestone or measure within 10 years. And we're in the proposal back in 2015 talked about 2055, 2040, and then we had this 2026, but it was 2026 coming down to near zero, and then with the odd eruption. That got translated into an absolute, and that then got translated into a reporting thing, which, you know, we're targeting 2026, we're doing that, and in court. But I suppose it really has been, it's been known that it was always a challenge, but that we're going to continue to drive it down. But this is actually what the proposal is saying reflects the reality, and the funders are fully behind that. It's not just Osprey saying, oh, we couldn't do it. The reality is the dynamic of biological systems means that it's not possible.
Thanks, Jonathan. A bit of a curly one there for you. But hey, look, we are close to finishing now. So thank you very much, Jonathan, for your presentation and for answering the questions that have been put to you. We are now, I'm going to hand over to Alan for some closing remarks.
Thanks very much, both, Will, for facilitating that question and answer session, and Jonathan for all your work in putting together this presentation and your explanation. I know you've done, along with Stu, a huge amount of work to get us to this point. For those on the call, we meet regularly as a governance and shareholder group, both of Osprey and on the PGG group. There's a lot of thought, a lot of effort goes into making sure that we're spending that taxpayer money as well as possible for our farmers. So thank you for those people who attended, and thank you to you for the work that you're doing, Jonathan.
Bye-bye. Kia ora.
I think that's wrap up, Nicole and Will, is that?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
We have one or two questions that we didn't get to, but we will get back to them with a response via email as well. But thank you all.
Okay, so thank you very much for making the time to attend.